Okay. Hello, 6 February. This and Datinformation. Today is going to continue what we were doing, what I sort of sped through yesterday before we were watching the uh, film, The 800. Um, Thanks for those who indulged my wanting to see the movie because there wasn't any way to watch it when it first came out. But and it sort of came and went, and no one sort of noticed it, or I suppose you could sort of write it off as a very large scale propaganda piece. But anyway, that's that. I'm going to continue what we were sort of left off with, and because I sped up a little yesterday to talk about Tony Lawson and social ontology, and I also want to remind you that um, ontological issues are important for various ecological things, um, particularly when you're trying to represent them in a sort of geospatial way, but that's not the only way you can talk about them. And Lawson is important because he continues that kind of work. Aside from his continuing, I think what is powerful about the difference between Oxford and Cambridge things. Um, I've included a an interview with Michael Löwy, and I'll get to that in a second. Uh, but I wanted to point out that I included a recent interview with Tony Lawson on economics and social ontology, and he includes some of the reasons for doing it, which is why I included the article yesterday on social relations, social positioning theory, and Marx. What brings all this together, of course, is the idea that social positioning is another way of talking about or answering, as it were, the issue of uh, a critique of the labor theory of value. That is, that you do not necessarily have to subscribe to a labor theory of value, although I think it has a certain viability, but it also needs to be sort of explained or interpreted within the context of Marx in sort of the post-war rereading of Marx as not anchored to, as it were, labor theory of value, because I think it's important to appreciate that Marx is writing in an age where there clearly was financialization, but it was sort of the end of kind of a weird mercantilism and the emergence of kind of the ebbs and flows of capitalism, and particularly with a whole variety of weird failures, the same kind of weird failures that we see going on now. In, for example, tariff policy is really a vestige. It's a very 19th century way of thinking about things. On the other hand, the 19th century ideology of, or anti-modern, as it were, kind of ideology of populism is pretty much wedded to those kinds of things that um, a kind of naive belief in protectionism, a kind of naive belief in racial or racialist theories. All of that, you know, is there, and it's still popular. It's unfortunate that people at a very basic level can kind of indulge, racism it's just at its most virulent. But that's kind of where we are right now, um, and and how it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's another thing. Anyway, so I introduced that kind of idea, and it as I said, I blew through it pretty quickly, but I think it's really important to look at some of the concluding elements on the Tony Larson article, simply because it gives us a better way in which we can appreciate what Marx is doing in the latter half of the 19th century. And so I left off yesterday, I think, ending on the issue of fetishism, but more specifically, let me just read the conclusion to Lawson to sort of give you a sense of kind of what we're talking about. Clearly, I've covered here only a fraction of Marx's contribution. Some of his most significant claims, categories, and insights have been barely mentioned at best. Even from the limited coverage provided, though, there can be little doubt that in Marx's social theorizing, social relations are everywhere crucial. And my assessment, that is Lawson's assessment, is that in his relational analyses, something like a social positioning theory framework is everywhere presupposed. I have urged, in fact, that various different sorts of relations figure in Marx's writings, whilst certain relations are presented according to context under their different aspects. Marx, though, spent relatively little time explicitly elaborating these differences, leaving his various statements open to competing, sometimes prima facie, incompatible interpretations. Such apparent incompatibility is easily dissolved, though, if through imputing a social positioning theory sort of framework to Marx, we interpret him as maintaining that human individuals are constituted by internal relations qua community components, but relatively autonomous of those relations qua human persons. So there's a set of abstractions going on here in the first instance. In the second instance, the basic relations that characterize both pre-capitalist and capitalist social formations are internal, though with external relations present in both cases, but having more significance in various ways within the later capitalist social formation. And three, in capitalism, the relational community component, that is the commodity, is constituted as such neither in the production process narrowly conceived nor in the exchange process, but somewhere in between via a process of community positioning. Hence all of this positioning discourse. Though value is, as traditionally argued, produced entirely in production if in conditions wholly specific to capitalism. The interpretation suggested also leaves all of Marx's main insights intact. Let me be clear, though, and finally, about what I am not suggesting here. The claim is not at all that Marx needs something like social positioning theory, that if only he had adopted such a conception, certain central claims made would be more coherent or whatever. Rather, I am suggesting that Marx was seemingly already in possession of something like a social positioning theory framework, that he got there long ago, which is why the two perspectives considered here sit so easily with one another. Marx, though, to repeat once more, does not elaborate his more general ontological commitments in an especially explicit, systematic, and sustained fashion. Mostly, he merely draws on them. It is because of this, no doubt, that there continues to be much deliberation about Marx's presuppositions of this sort and their supposed ambiguities. This being so, the hypothesis that Marx draws upon a framework along the lines of social positioning theory, which, as we have seen easily enough, provides a resolution of many of those apparent ambiguities, is, I suggest, worth considering further, not least in relation to other aspects of Marx's writings and concerns not considered here. So, it may or may not be as rigorous a kind of approach. The point being is that I think it is as ecumenical as things are, that a social positioning approach is important, and because it allows us to talk about internal and external relations, which I think is the key element of the 21st century approach to Marx, is that we talk about internal relations, external relations, either of which is social. Let's read the little bit here, part of the interview with Tony Lawson. What's the current state of economics? Well, it's in a bit of a mess. Mostly, I would say it's irrelevant, does not attempt to address the way the world really is. It's much more concerned with conforming to an image of science, which, as it happens, is not a good image of science, leading very many modern economists to proceed in ways that are mostly irrelevant. And then the interviewer asks, well, why is it irrelevant? Is it because of the features of social reality? Yes, precisely. Let me take the opportunity to say that the problem stems from the use of certain methods. But I'm not criticizing the methods, I'm criticizing the inappropriate use of them. Economists choose the methods in an a priori fashion. I mean, to be blunt or specific, they use methods of mathematical modeling, whatever the context. Note, of course, that Lawson's undergraduate degree is in math. In any other discipline, they start with a problem and then the context. They look into they look at the nature of the problem being addressed, and they design methods to fit the tasks, the world, the context they're dealing with. Economists for the last 60 years have started from the assumption, this is the method, give me the problem. If I said to you, I've got a task, will you come and help me? Bring your tools. Without telling you what tools to bring, I mean, first of all, you'd probably say get lost. But if I offered you a few £1,000,000, you'd likely say, well, what tools? What's the task? What do I need to bring? It's very similar to AI. Economists don't ask that question, what is the nature of the task? For the last 60 years, they've insisted on the same type of tool for all jobs, all applications, forms of mathematical modeling. As it happens, these methods don't fit social reality very well at all, mostly inappropriate to its analysis everywhere, given its nature. This is a critique, of course, of neoclassical economics. So, this is the problem. It is firstly a failure to consider the nature of context and say, well, what are the appropriate tools? And it is secondly in erroneously adopting a universal approach a priori. They have relied upon tools of a sort that, as it happens, are hardly useful at all. The sorts of methods mathematical economists use presuppose closed systems, worlds in which correlations, event regularities occur. Such regularities are guaranteed in conditions where economic agents, whatever they are, or conform to acting as isolated atoms. By atoms, I mean that they have the same independent variable effect, whatever the context. Social reality is just not like that. It's open. Rather than agents being fixed, they're in process. Rather than agents being isolated, as social beings, all are relationally constituted. So this makes obviously this increases our problems. It's easier to assume away. If you assume away these relations, then it's a lot easier to solve, but then you're not dealing with reality. And the interviewer asks, you argue that we need more discussion of the ontology of social reality. Why is that? And Lawson says, one thing I think it's important to recognize is that ontology is not something mysterious. It's not something that only goes on in philosophy departments. In fact, social ontology doesn't formally happen there very much. Implicitly, though, we all do it. Walking down the street, you'll act differently according to whether the thing in front of you is a lamppost, a person, an elephant, or whatever. You just react differently. Arguing for an ontological turn is not about recommending a turn to something that's mystical or for experts. It's just about making explicit and systematic what we do each implicitly all the time. If you've got a problem in the house or in the garden, you choose tools appropriately. You don't just take the nearest tool or the tool you like best and go and try it out for everything. You condition your choice according to the nature of the task. It's not an anti-methods proposal. It's a pro-being critically aware proposal. And I think that's important. I've already stressed it, but I will stress it again. This is not an anti-mathematics stand. It's not an anti-science stand. In fact, I think it's a pro-mathematics and pro-science stand. It's an anti-mismatch stand, an anti-using the wrong tool for the task stand. Or more positively, it's pro making sure that whatever your task, you've got the right sort of tools for it If in certain situations they turn out to be mathematical in nature, fine. But typically they won't be in the social realm. Now, that all sounds like a lot of sort of contingent humming, hemming, and hawing, but I think it is about a kind of realism. It is a critical realism in that particular sense, and acknowledging the existence of an outside world that you sort of have to accommodate, and that sort of underlies, I think, the Tony Lawson approach, which I think has mellowed in later years. And the solution in the article was, of course, to accommodate both or to acknowledge that there are certain Ricardian assumptions that you can sort of abide by in terms of Marx, but that you don't sort of rigidly assume the necessity of them. I think that they're sufficient. That it is, of course, that um, you know the critique of political economy is a critique of Ricardo, among others, and that's kind of part of the deal for Marx. But you also have to realize there's a certain moving past Ricardo that's really important, and that to retain a kind of neo-Ricardian sort of approach in order to hang on to a labor theory of value is not really a good thing. I think that there's this moment at which you have to sort of say, and pretty interesting people have moved beyond that in interesting ways, so that you could say, and I'm not saying it here, but you could say that certain interests, that is, for example, the fact that Straffa and Wittgenstein actually knew each other, that there's something else going on, and very little of that has to do with the labor theory of value, but it is more important, and it does something to perhaps influence the notion of what Straffa, at least, was talking about, at least in the simplified version of a concept of the commodity. So that I think there's more work to be done in that particular place. So anyway, that's a kind of the reason why one thinks of Lawson. Now to move to Löwy. It's an interview with Löwy in an anti-capitalist review, and done really recently. So what I like doing in these last couple of days is to pick thought that is very current, as opposed to reading the 19th century text, although I'll close today with a look again at that letter from 1863 from Marx to Engels. Anyway, this is an interview with Michael Löwy, Karl Marx and Ecology, an interview. And It's undeniable that Marx was interested in the environmental problems of his time and criticized the damage caused by the capitalist mode of production. But it has to be said that ecological themes do not occupy a central place in Marxian theory, and that Marx's writings on the relationship between human societies and nature are far from unambiguous and therefore open to different interpretations. Many ecologists are critical of Marx and urge Marxists to abandon the red paradigm and adopt the green one. There's a body of literature that talks about the red-green discourses. What are their main arguments? According to the ecologists, Marx, following in the footsteps of the English economist David Ricardo, attributed the origin of all value and wealth to human labor, neglecting the contribution of nature. This criticism stems from a misunderstanding. Marx uses the theory of labor value to explain the origin of exchange value within the capitalist system. On the other hand, nature is involved in the formation of real wealth, which is not exchange value, but use value. This position is very explicitly articulated in Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program, 1875, a text directed against the ideas of the German socialist Ferdinand Lassalle and his followers. Labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values. And surely these are what make up material wealth as labor. Labor is itself only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. So the next question is, ecologists accuse Marx and Engels of productivism. Is this accusation justified? Löwy responds, no, insofar as one denounced the capitalist logic of production for production's sake. The accumulation of capital, wealth, and commodities as an end in itself more than Marx did. The very idea of socialism, in contrast to its miserable bureaucratic counterfeits, is that of the production of use values, goods needed for the satisfaction of human needs. This is, the Anthropocene. The supreme objective of technical progress, according to Karl Marx, is not the infinite increase of goods having, but the reduction of the working day and the increase of free time, which is being. However, it is true that Marx and Engels, and even more so later Marxists, are often uncritical of the system of industrial production created by capital and tend to make the development of the productive forces the main vector of progress. Now, from this point of view, the canonical text is the famous preface to the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. One of Marx's writings most marked by a certain evolutionism, noting, of course, that Marx did read Darwin, by the philosophy of progress, by scientism, the model of the natural sciences, and by an unproblematic view of the productive forces. And Marx would say, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed. And in this famous passage, the, existing productive forces are not called into question. The only task of the revolution is to abolish the relations of production that have become a fetter on their unlimited development. And the following passage from the Grundrisse, that is the 1857 to 59 prequel to Capital, is a good example of Marx's rather too uncritical admiration for the civilizing work of capitalist production and its brutal instrumentalization of nature. So Marx says, quote, thus capital creates the bourgeois society and the universal appropriation of nature, as well as the social bond itself by the members of society. Hence the great civilizing influence of capital, its production of a stage of society in comparison to which all earlier ones appear as mere local developments of humanity and as nature idolatry. For the first time, nature becomes purely an object for humankind, purely a matter of utility, ceases to be recognized as a power for itself, and the theoretical discovery of its autonomous laws appears merely as a ruse so as to subjugate it under human needs, whether as an object of consumption or as a means of production. So this still uncritical view of capitalism's relationship with nature, you should go out and exploit it, would be superseded in the years that followed. In fact, Marx's and Engels' writings on nature should be seen not as a uniform block, but as thought in motion. This is the argument made in a recent book by a young Japanese researcher, Kohei Saito, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capitalism, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy. He shows the evolution of Marx's reflection on the natural environment in a process of learning, rectification, and reformulation of his thought. No comment here, of course, on the kind of overemphasis of or the critique of the Anthropocene by Saito. Admittedly, on certain questions, there is great continuity in Marx's writings. This is particularly true of his rejection of the capitalist separation between human beings and the land, i.e., nature. Marx was convinced that in primitive societies there existed a kind of unity between producers and the land, and he saw it as one of the most important tasks of socialism to reestablish this unity that was destroyed by bourgeois society. But on a higher level, that is, this is the negation of the negation, the sort of third part of how the dialectic operates. This explains Marx's interest in pre-modern communities, both in his ecological thinking and in his anthropological study, drawing respectively on Karl Frost and Franz Mauer, two authors he considered to be unconscious socialists. But on most questions about the environment, Saito highlights notable changes. Before Capital, that is the 1867 Capital, Marx's writings were rather uncritical of capitalist progress. This is evident in the Communist Manifesto, which celebrates the subjection or the subjugation of the forces of nature and the clearing of entire continents by the bourgeoisie. The changes began in 1865 to 66, when Marx discovered, through the writings of the agricultural chemist Justus von Liebig, the problems of soil depletion and the metabolic breakdown between human societies and nature. Now, this led Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, 1867, as well as in the other two unfinished volumes, Volume 2 and 3, to take a much more critical view of the damage caused by capitalist progress. Thus, in several passages of Capital that concern agriculture, we see the emergence of a genuine ecological problematic and a radical critique of the catastrophes resulting from capitalist productivism. Marx puts forward a kind of theory of the breakdown of the metabolism between human societies and nature resulting from capitalist productivism. The expression Riss des Stoffwechsels or metabolic rift, literally rift in material exchange, appears in a passage in chapter 47, the genesis of capitalist ground rent, of volume 3 of Capital. And it reads as follows. On the one hand, large landed property reduces the agricultural population to an ever-decreasing minimum and confronts it with an ever-growing industrial population crammed together in large towns. In this way, it produces conditions that provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. So, it is there's a certain poetic kind of application here, I suppose, in terms of the idea of a metabolism. As in most of the examples we'll go on to see, this Löwy again, Marx's attention is focused here on agriculture and the problems of soil devastation, but he links this question to a more general principle, the rupture in the system of material exchange between human societies and the environment in contradiction with the natural laws of life. The theme of metabolic rift is also found in a passage in Volume 1 of Capital. This is a text in which Marx discusses most explicitly the ravages wrought by capital on the natural environment. A dialectic vision of the contradictions of the progress induced by the productive forces then emerges. This is Marx. Capitalist production disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country proceeds from large-scale industry as the background of its development, as in the case of the United States, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. So, several aspects are notable in this text. First of all, the idea that progress can be destructive, a progress in the deterioration and destruction of the natural environment. Here, the exploitation and degradation of workers in nature are placed in parallel as a result of the same predatory logic that prevails in the development of capitalist industry and agriculture. So you can see that ultimately, in the later period, we see a ecological consciousness, a sense that the social ontology is also a ecology in that sense, or a social ecology. This direct association made by Marx between the exploitation of the proletariat and the exploitation of the soil is a good starting point for thinking about the link between class struggle and the struggle to defend the environment in a common struggle against the domination of capital. After the exhaustion of the soil, the other example of ecological catastrophe frequently mentioned by Marx and Engels is the destruction of forests. Remember that Marx starts by a problem that is related to the forest, right? The whole business of being able to pick up uh, you know, branches on the ground and take it home for firewood. It appears several times in Capital. The development of civilization and of industry in general has always shown itself so active in the destruction of forests that everything that has been done for their conservation and production is completely insignificant in comparison. The two phenomena, the degradation of forests and that of the soil, are closely linked in their analysis. So the point here, of course, that Löwy is making, that there's something that connects all of these, and that there are things that can be catastrophic, and the rifts are not isolated in terms of nature and humans, but that they're obviously, and we know this from recent wildfires, they're all kind of connected together, and that we can see that many things can be both successful and unsuccessful in dealing with them. So those are the kind of connections I want to make for today. The idea of a social ontology is also connects to other kinds of ontologies. And there are biological and environmental ontologies that are actually important, that are part and parcel of, ecological ontologies are important as well, because where else would you be in that particular sense in the world? Um, and then I want to close today by reading from part of the letter to Frederick Engels of 6 July 1863. And I think there is a kind of understanding of, for example, the Civil War is going on at the same time, so you need to get a sense of what's going on. So let's see. There is a kind of critique in here in the letter. If at all possible in this heat, will you please take a reasonably close look at the enclosed tableau économique, which I am substituting for Quenet's table, and let me know your objections, if any. It embraces the whole process of reproduction. As you know, Adam Smith sees the natural or necessary price as being composed of wages, profit, that is, interest, and rent, i.e., as a wholly resolved into revenue. This nonsense has been taken over by Ricardo, although he excludes rent from the catalog as being purely fortuitous. Nearly all economists have taken this over from Smith, and those who contest it succumb to some other folly. Smith himself is conscious of the nonsensicality of subsuming the gross product of a society simply under revenue, which may be consumed annually. Whereas in the case of each individual branch of production, he resolves price into capital, that is, raw materials, machinery, etc., and revenue, wages, profit, and rent. Now, if this were so, a society would have to start each year de novo without capital. This is that important point, and the critique that Marx always makes, whether it is Smith or Ricardo or whatever, is, that is a problem in some ways simply of accounting periods, or thinking about accounting periods, or amortization, depreciation, et cetera, and all of these objections are important objections in the sense that you need to see this as a larger whole, an ontology, as it were. And his diagram sort of reveals that there are actually dotted lines and straight lines, although it's not clear on this particular version of it, these versions of it. But here's Marx talking about the tables that I introduced from yesterday. Now, as regards my table, which figures in one of the last chapters of my work by way of recapitulation, the following is essential to a proper understanding of it. Number one, the figures, which are arbitrary, represent millions. So, he's already getting a sense that this must happen at scale. Number two, here means of subsistence are taken to mean everything that goes into the consumption fund each year, or might, without accumulation, which is excluded from the table, go into the consumption fund. In class one, that is means of subsistence, the gross product, 700, consists of means of subsistence, which are by their very nature not therefore included in constant capital, raw materials, machinery, buildings, etc. Similarly, in class 2, the entire product consists of commodities that constitute constant capital, i.e., re-enter the process of reproduction in the form of raw materials and machinery. Number 3, ascending lines are dotted, descending ones continuous. Constant capital is that part of capital that consists of raw materials and machinery. Variable capital is that which is exchanged for labor. This is all very clear, and I, of course, have yammered on previously in tabular form on this difference. Number 5, for example, in agriculture, etc., one part of the same product, that is wheat, goes to form means of subsistence, where another part, wheat, for instance, re-enters reproduction in its natural form, for example, as seed, as a raw material. But this does nothing to alter the case, since such branches of production figure under class 2 or class 1 according to which capacity is involved. Number 6, the hub of the matter, then, is as follows. Category 1, means of subsistence, working materials and machinery, for example, 400 pounds sterling, i.e. that part of these which is included in the annual product as déchet, that part of the machinery which is not used up, does not figure at all in the table. The variable capital exchange for labor equals 100, reproduces itself as 300, since 100 replaces wages in the shape of the product, and 200 represents surplus value, that is unpaid surplus labor. The product equals 700, of which 400 represents the value of the constant capital, which, however, is passed into the product and hence thus must be replaced. In the case of this relationship between variable capital and surplus value, it is assumed that the worker works a third of the working day for himself and 2/3 for his natural superiors. Hence, 100 variable capital, as is indicated by the dotted line, is paid out in money as wages. With this 100, indicated by the descending line, the worker buys the product of this class, i.e., means of subsistence for 100 pounds. Thus, the money flows back to capitalist class 1. The surplus value of 200 in its general form equals profit, which, however, is split up into industrial profit, commercial included, and further into interest, which the industrial capitalist pays in money, and rent, which he likewise pays in money. This money paid out for industrial profit, interest, and rent flows back, indicated by descending lines, since the product of class 1 is brought in return to it. Hence, all the money laid out by the industrial capitalist within class 1 flows back to him, while 300 of the product, 700 is consumed by the workers, entrepreneurs, moneyed men, and landlords. In class 1, this leaves a surplus of product of means of subsistence of 400 and a deficit of constant capital of 400. Category 2, machinery and raw materials. Since the gross product of this category, not only that part of the product which replaces constant capital, but also that which represents the equivalent of wages and surplus value, consists of raw materials and machinery. The revenue of this category cannot be realized in its own product, but only in the product of category 1. Disregarding accumulation, as is done here, category 1 can, however, buy only as much from category 2 as it needs for the replacement of its constant capital, while category 2 can lay out on the product of category 1 only that part of its product which represents wages and surplus value or revenue. Hence, the workers in category 2 lay out their money, 133 1/3, on the product of category 2. The same thing happens with the surplus value in category 2, which as subject 1 is split up into industrial profit, interest, and rent. Hence, 400 in money flows from category 2 to the industrial capitalists in category 1, who in return transfer the remainder of their product, 400, to the former. With this 400 in money, class 1 buys what is necessary to replace its constant capital, 400, from category 2, to which the money paid out in wages and consumption by the industrial capitalists themselves, the moneyed men and the landlords, thus flows back. Hence, category 2 retains 533 1/3 of its gross product, and with this, it replaces its own constant capital, which has been used up. The movement, partly within category 1, partly within category 1 and 2, also shows how money flows back to the respective industrial capitalists in both categories, money which will then go to pay wages, interest, and rent. Now, what about category three? Category three represents reproduction as a whole. The gross product of category two is shown here as the constant capital of society as a whole, and the gross product of category one as that part of the product which replaces the variable capital, the wages fund, and the revenues of the classes which share the surplus value between them. I put Kinne's table underneath and will explain in some words in my next letter. So, he's trying to figure this damn stuff out. And so you can see sort of, you have ascending, descending, um, uh, one, means of subsistence, two, machinery and raw materials, and three, gross product. So something's going on here. This is not as clear as I think as some might make it. And in fact, in volume two, you see him fussing with the same kind of problems. How is this change within the context of periods? He's starting to get this idea of, well, okay, there's circulation occurs and it occurs over time. It's in movement. And so you can start with certain ideas at the front end in terms of, wages are necessary as means of subsistence, that they have a relation to variable capital. They're that part of it. And then there is a surplus that is part of the profit that is assumed, that becomes profit, industrial profit, interest and rent. Uh, in terms of the product at 700, which is also taken from it, it goes out as expended profit and constitutes a surplus value there, and as variable capital in terms of the contrast between constant and variable capital. And so all of these things account for the product itself at 933 and a third, the gross product, which is divided up at 933 goes down here. The surplus value is divided up relative to variable capital and surplus value. And so the final product is 633 and a third. So um, it is a little confusing, I suppose, even though he's trying to do this arithmetically in terms of what he starts out with and what he winds up with. And he'd like to show that something is happening and that surplus is derived from this. And so I think that that's kind of what we get finally. And he tries to apply this, of course, to how Quenet's tableau économique operates. And the important point that we get from this is that it's not a single moment in time, but rather multiple moments in time. That's what the tableau describes is increasing moments of when things occur, what is being accumulated or produced or consumed. All of those things is an attempt by Quenet to assume it in tabular form. Now, the problem, of course, is that Quenet is using certain types of data that don't necessarily measure everything. It measures a certain degree of what things are worth or output or revenue, but in some ways doesn't truly, of course, sort of accommodate the widest range of things. And ultimately, and what Marx actually gets from Quenet is that, yes, well, class divisions actually are very important in assuming how all this sort of data operates. And ultimately, that's what he gets to at the end, which is important. I mean, you have to just see it in this historical context that Quenet is writing at a time when a lot of these things aren't fully resolved, that they're resolved on paper, certainly within the context of, trying to do some kind of measure of all of these matters and thinking, as Quenet does, of the economy as a kind of uh, human circulatory system. So he's thinking of it, but it doesn't quite work the way that he wants to work. In fact, I think the blood analogy is not the best, not necessarily the best analogy, but it is certainly how Quenet is operating. Anyway, I'm going to close there. We will talk about other matters. Uh, the heroes were Nazis. Well, I'll answer that later. But the idea is that the nationalists, the Chinese nationalists, they got their training and a lot of their material from Germany. Remember, this is Germany in the 1930s. So they still have all those cute little helmets and um, the Mauser K98 or whatever rifle. So those are all there. And um, it seems a little weird for one part of China to look so German as opposed to the Japanese who look as it were Japanese. Anyway, I'll stop there. We can answer questions, I assume, off the line. Um, so, Joe, if you want to stop the live stream, I will stop the share. Oh, I have it. So